Welcome to Funnel Reboot, the podcast that shares ideas on how to upgrade your lead generation. Here is your host, Glenn Schmeltzley.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot. Today, we'll learn how to win people's buy-in by telling them stories. But first, I would absolutely love to hear if you've heard anything on these episodes that made you think, anything that you liked or didn't like. I want your feedback. Please hit me up on social or leave a call on the listener feedback line 613-703-7073. So stop me if you've heard this one before. You've taken on a marketing initiative that is finally going somewhere. And now it's time for management to see what you've done and approve more funds, or at least give you props for all your hard work. But on presenting your data, all you're met with is blank stares or nitpicking centered around how you put your data together. What's going wrong when this happens? Well, it's probably that your audience couldn't boil it down into something that makes sense to them. The universal structure that all of us use to do this is stories. And my guest uses stories to present the performance of her pay-per-click marketing programs. It's her contention that using a story-like framework works to your advantage. She has managed Google Ads since 2004, working her way through at least half a dozen agencies. In 2017, she and her husband James co-founded Paid Search Magic, which provides coaching and audits and reporting, and even courses for those who want to get better at search engine marketing. She's lived in a handful of states and even 2 Central American countries. Fun fact, she worked once for a man who was in charge of the company website, and he was so old school he didn't even know how to get onto an internet website, and he asked her which key on the keyboard was the dot key, as in .com. She joins us today from her new home base, which is in Tennessee. Please welcome Amy Hebdon. I'm so glad to welcome Amy Hebdon. Welcome to the show, Amy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad to have you. And we're going to talk about something that you are especially good at. I even think it's your superpower. And it has to do with how we communicate what we're doing in digital marketing, specifically with data. Do you want to tell us for a second how long you've been doing paid search marketing?
Yeah, I've been doing Google Ads / AdWords since about 2004.
Yeah, that's quite some time. So you've run into it on all sides, right? On the agency side, probably doing some of your own as well as coaching other people in doing theirs.
Yeah, a lot of freelance and contractor as well, and a little bit kind of contract in-house. So kind of, got to experience that on all fronts.
Awesome. And I know that when you and I get together at our industry conferences, we talk about how things are changing and, they're changing every 5 seconds, it seems. Mm-hmm. But there are some aspects that never change and that you found over 18 years that is always part of what it takes to do this. You want to tell me about what you don't think changes?
Well, I think that there are some things even within how we approach paid search marketing that doesn't change, but specifically something that's pretty consistent is having stakeholders that we are reporting to. That for the most part, that's a constant part of our business, is being able to take what we're doing on the data strategy implementation side for Google Ads and paid search, and finding ways to translate that to our stakeholders in a way that they can appreciate and understand and take action on in meaningful ways.
Wow, that was very well said. So these are normally senior business people, and although they're extremely smart at business, there are probably some things that we should recognize they don't know about what it is we're doing, even if they're the one who's hired us to do this, right?
Yeah, that's very true. And we would hope that there's someone who is in the C-suite. A lot of times that's not necessarily the case. I've had some very very junior people be in charge of this too, and that makes it all the more challenging to try to, ultimately what we're trying to do in a lot of cases is to more disrupt what the expectation is, right? Because if someone somewhere has this idea that paid search is about getting a lot of impressions at a good cost per impression and getting clicks at a good cost per click, and all that's going to funnel in to perform and get, conversions as an acceptable conversion rate. If that's the idea that someone has and we're trying to disrupt that and say, hey, there's actually a better way to do it, then we're challenging that assumption. And sometimes we can challenge someone who's in a bit of a higher seat, like, oh, that's interesting, I hadn't thought of that. Whereas someone who's maybe, brand new is going to say, that doesn't sound like what I heard, so no. And it can become even harder. And so it really is a question of who am I trying to help make these decisions, and how do I need to go about that? And at that point, it's not just what data do I have, but how am I going to curate that data and show it to someone in a way that's going to help inform their decisions and justify um, taking action that's going to better affect the outcomes and grow the business.
Yeah, and we ignore them at our peril, right? These are people who, if we don't give them a sense that we understand how to get them meeting their own objectives, they can remove us from running their campaigns, or they could slash our budgets, right? There's a bunch of things where I think marketers are especially vulnerable to someone who's critical of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no guarantee that we're going to be around next week on the account. A number of things could happen. And we've seen things like that happen over the years where something that seemed like a sure bet actually turned out to be really expendable. And that's something we have to be aware of. And the best antidote for that is to be able to continually prove value, right, in a way that someone else understands.
So I'll throw this out. So you're saying I'm not adding value if I'm simply going into my Google Ads interface, grabbing that, 16 column table and dropping it into a report and sending it to them?
Well, at the end of the day, I think a lot of times they're like, hey, as long as we move the needle and we're driving business for them, then that's all that they care about or should care
We
about.
think.
Yeah. I thought this was true for a really, really long time. Like, I'm in, to any extent that I'm good at this now, I have been embarrassingly bad about it for a large portion of my career. And what I have found, we kind of tell ourselves, especially in a data-driven industry where, we're doing marketing, we're dealing with data all the time. We tell ourselves like, well, my client just cares about the data, right? My stakeholder, like anything else you could tell me that, I need to tell a story or I need to do this or that, they're not going to care. They only care about the data. And I thought that was true. But what I've learned is that people don't care about the numbers. They care about how they feel about the numbers. So if you can help them to feel a certain way about the same number, I mean that's all it is. Even like at an economic level, it's like, well, is this too much money or is it a good deal? How do I
Yeah.
feel about that? Well, that's based on the information that I have about something else that I carry with me in my head. There's
That's
really
how we treat every other purchase we make.
Yeah, there's I mean, and it's true for anything, right? For a mattress or a table or a house or a car or your interest rate or anything, it's all relative to what else is available and how you feel about the purchase or the decision. So if we can influence the way someone feels about the number, that's going to be more valuable than to just present the number or even obscure the number because we threw so much at them they don't even know how to find it in the first place.
Yeah, and they're smart. They've either built their own business or they're at a high level in the executive ranks of that business. Obscuring isn't going to work. Or trying to show them all these other columns when their eye is simply going to hop over those and go to the furthest one on the right, zip down to the bottom, and they'll try to figure out something without any context. So we're not really doing our job at all if we do this, right? Instead, you have a special process that you've developed that you think does a really good job of trying to make it so that they understand more and also help you achieve what you're trying to get out of this. Can you describe that for me?
Sure. Well, so the framework that I recommend using is the problem, agitate, solve model, and it's essentially a sales model of. We can talk about it in terms of conversion, right? It helps someone understand the problem and ultimately leads them to a solution, which requires converting from their old way of doing things to a new way of doing things, right? That's what conversion is. So we can apply that to our reports, and as well as our relationships with clients, and use that process on our stakeholders, not just the end users that we're marketing to.
So I don't want marketers to freak out here. If they think Amy's asking them to do something completely brand new, listen to what she said. You're getting them to think about how they've been doing things before and possibly take your suggestion on how to do them differently, which is a conversion, which, of course, that's what marketing does, right? We're pretty good at optimizing that. We just sometimes forget to turn around and do it in our own work the way that we do it on client stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's has been something that I've learned from myself over years, and like we've been talking about, this isn't something that's taught a whole lot, and it probably should be, because like will insist that we treat our landing pages with a certain amount of respect and our end users with respect, and we want to make it as easy for our end user to accomplish the task we have in front of them. Right? We need to get rid of, if there's anxiety, we need to get rid of it. We need to get rid of friction. We need to build momentum so it's really easy to say yes. But then with our reporting, we just kind of take it for granted that someone else should understand what we're doing. But all we've done is throw a bunch of numbers up on the screen or the page, and they don't know how to interpret it. If you're dealing with someone who knows how to ignore everything that doesn't belong there and focus on what's essential, you've got yourself a really smart client, and you're in a better position to be able to have conversations. And if you're dealing with someone who's not very data literate, who looks at the table of 16 columns, doesn't know where to start, and so then you end up having conversations about minutia that you really shouldn't be in the position of having to explain anyway, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
in a way, it's good if you can get someone to focus on what matters, but more often we are dealing with things that don't even matter, and that's where we're spending our time because we didn't do a good job of curating the report and focusing on the real problem in the first place.
So if we get rid of most of the data on the report and we make the numbers that can point out the problem come to the foreground, that's going to give them, well, first off, they don't have to think as hard,
Right.
but they then can actually do something that I know you want in this first stage, which is the problem stage. You want them to see that problem not as something that you're talking about or that you found while you were up at 10 o'clock at night working on the campaign, right? Whose problem is it?
Right. So ultimately they need to understand it's their problem, right? Because even if we do, even if we're not involved, like we didn't create the problem. I don't know if you're familiar with this the concept of rats in the cellar, but this idea, it's from C.S. Lewis, where like if you go down into the cellar and you turn the light on, there's a bunch of rats. And
Oh,
you're like,
I see. Turn off the
the
light quick.
right, exactly. Exactly. The problem is still there. And if we could identify it and bring it to light, like we need to help our stakeholders understand, here's how the problem is affecting you. It's not that I'm showing you a problem because I'm incompetent and bringing you problems, but we need to look at this together to understand how this is going to be solved. Because it's most problems need us, like if we could solve the problem without our clients help, then it's not even a problem, it's just
True.
part of our optimization process. But it becomes a problem when we need something else. Either they need to like increase investment somewhere, or they need to put more resources behind something, or there's something that's external to the organization, something going on in the landscape or in how people react to something.
Yeah.
We've experienced that a lot over the last several years,
Yeah.
where there's problems that isn't because we were bad at marketing, but because of something else entirely. So we need to understand what that thing is that we can't solve on our own, and then how to go about fixing it. But I think we're a lot of times we're afraid to show problems because it makes it look like it was something on our end, that is some sort of deficiency or incompetence. But it's actually the opposite. It's us understanding what's impacting performance and then finding ways to either control for that or solve for that, to improve outcomes.
Couldn't agree more. I find the place where it's simplest, and I'm sure you find it the same. Both of us do audits, And if you are speaking to someone who is senior, you can be honest about that. There's no ongoing relationship. There's a one-time project here. And you can say to them, whether we work together or not, this is something that you need to know about and it needs to be addressed. And I know it's a little counter to maybe how some marketers are wired, but they will most of the time thank you for enlightening them.
Right. Yeah, people need to understand the problem, and they also need to understand that we're not causing the problems. We need to make sure we're clear on both of those things.
But that's the flip
Yeah.
side. If they don't know enough about the problem and they even hear the hint of it when our name is mentioned, they may glue the problem to us incorrectly. So
Right.
we have to learn to speak up about it. So that's the problem stage. We've kind of gone sideways here into the function of this three set, which is kind of like a 3-act play or a story.
Hmm.
You explain that in problem we want them to really embrace it. So are they the hero of the story?
Yeah, so I think it's natural for us to want to present ourselves as the hero of the story, right? We're the ones who are going to solve this problem for you so you don't have problems. That's why you hired us. And if we're not doing that, then you have no reason to keep us on, right? Or
We think that.
right. But what actually happens is that we're essentially playing at a different level. So we're Yoda to their Luke Skywalker. And by positioning them as essentially the hero of the story, not only are we that trusted guide, right? Like we're not it's not a business risk to be the person who helps someone else look really good, right? Like that's really beneficial for us if we can make them look good by taking those actions they need to take, by understanding their data better, by bringing in a good agency or hiring someone to help in the first place. But ultimately, we all have a perspective or a lens where we are the people that matter most. And if we're trying to pit ego against ego, we're saying, hey, these are your priorities, but these are our priorities, and you need to care more about ours than yours. That's never going to happen. But when we
No.
can make these priorities, these things that need to happen in order for business growth to occur, then if they understand that, the more buy-in that they have, then the easier it becomes for them to recognize what needs to change and for them to change it. So we're not there arguing about it and saying, "Oh, if only they listened to my ideas," but instead we've got
Yeah.
our stakeholders taking action because they do understand it. But it's a process to get to that point. But that's
Yeah.
why it is so important, is that these are their problems, not just we're not bringing them problems. We're helping them understand the landscape and what needs to be solved.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We confuse what it is we would need them to say yes to for solving the problem, and we push that right up to the front, which succeeds about as much as walking into your boss's office and saying, "I need a raise."
Right,
Right? It
right.
doesn't. It
Here are
doesn't.
my goals. Here's what's going to help
Yeah.
me in my job. Great.
What are you doing for me?
Right.
So no, but we can get, as long as we illustrate the impact of the problem correctly, that's going to, just it'll take care of itself, right? I guess
Hmm.
that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So then we get into the middle step. Can you tell us about that and how it's probably counterintuitive? Because I want to jump right to the solution now. What is this middle step doing here?
Right. So between problem and solution, there's agitation, and this does feel counterintuitive, especially if you've got more of an engineering background, where you're just like, identify problem, solve problem, done. Why would we need this middle step? And the reason we need it is because we need for our clients to feel how much something matters in order for them to take action on it. If they don't, if it feels like it's just as good to not solve the problem as to solve it, that's where you run into trouble. So for instance, if I say, okay, well, you've got a window that isn't energy efficient and it's costing you $1 a month, and to fix it would be $100. Well, then the solution, the juice isn't worth the squeeze there. But if we
Yeah.
say over the next 20 years, this thing is going to add up and get worse, and it's going to cost you thousands of dollars on your energy bill, and I can fix it, and the cost of solving it is less than the cost of the problem. That's what we wanted to accomplish. So the agitation is basically helping the problem feel as bad as it is to not take action, so that it's preferable to take action, because action is always hard, right? It's a lot easier to just talk about resolutions than to actually do them. And especially when we're dealing with marketing teams and resources and budgets and all these things, it's easier to do nothing. So if we really want someone to be able to take action in that next step of solution, then agitating the problem, making it feel uncomfortable, making it seem like the best thing to do is to actually do this hard thing of taking action. That's where we need to be if we want that next step to occur.
Yeah, there's a phenomenon here that the decision maker goes through, I guess, in the psychology of it, and this is where and why in every story that happens, the protagonist always encounters struggle, right? They call it a reversal of fortune or something that is a setback.
Right.
We think that the protagonist, is just going to that maybe we can skip that and just get right to the good part. But if we don't do that setback, what we're actually preventing them from doing is looking at it from all angles. And we're also preventing them from bringing their own insights that could make the solution, fully realized. And this is where I think we have to admit as marketers that we may not have the whole story, even though we're kind of taking them along on this track. We both work with B2B companies. In ones I work with, there's often a person who has sales in their title. And this is a very valuable stage to dwell on and leave some white space in. They will say things at this moment that I had no idea were on their mind or that they were even seeing it. And now they're starting to mentally make connections. I've heard it put this way, that one of the reasons IKEA furniture is so successful and people tend to keep returning there is you have to take the time to put it together. That's part of what makes you care about what you have put in your house and why people tend to go in there. They're not solving your problem by just saying presto, it's there. No, you had to do some work. And I think this is the same factor at play.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I don't remember the name of the bias, but yeah, if we build our own furniture, we value it more than if we bought it, right? Like we would need more money if we were going to sell it. And I think another thing really interesting about IKEA is that when you buy it, you buy a box. Like, why are you buying a box? It's because you've seen an image of what this thing can look like. And so you're willing to do the work of getting to that point. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of times as marketers, we don't think about that. We don't think about, someone needs to see the end game in order to want to do it. Like, you couldn't just sell a box and say, well, why don't you build it? And maybe you like it, maybe you won't, but at that point you'll know. Like, we need to be able to future pace and present here's what the solution is going to feel like in order for it to make sense to put in the labor of getting there in the first place. And we just forget that. We're just like, here's the numbers. So what do we want them to do about it? We have to take into account what they're experiencing, emotionally in response to what we're presenting, not just say, here's the data, now make the logical decision when it's just not obvious what to do next.
Yeah. And most times, returning back to what you said about how people feel about something, most times we have to spend time in this part because it's not going to be the almighty dollar that actually is, going to rule the day. They're not just going to say, okay, go with option B because that dollar is lower. You have shown in some past examples some wonderful ways where you have made ratios out of numbers and you've tried to boil it down into something that makes a definitive difference in their business, like open tables at a restaurant or somewhere that they have, let's say, unused time as a consultant in their day, or maybe they're not at the highest marginal rate, and you can show them these things, and that's what actually will be the lever that they want to see and they start to really latch onto, right?
Right. And so this comes down to understanding what the clients, or excuse me, the stakeholders' KPIs are. And it's not always obvious to us because a lot of times we have assumptions. We come in and say, "Oh, your goal is to have, get more revenue over time, or your goal is to decrease the cost per acquisition." We have these ideas. Sometimes there's not even a conversation about it. Sometimes there is like a brief conversation just to confirm that we were right, and that's it. But what will happen a lot of times is that the KPI is something that we didn't really understand or don't know about. So for instance, I was talking to someone about this where he was able to like say, "Hey, look, we increased your conversion rates," and the guy's like, "Okay, cool." Like, what do you want me to do about that? Like, it wasn't going to go anywhere. He's like, "No, we got you all this more revenue. Like, look how much more revenue it is." He's like, "Okay." But it turns out that person in that team was measured on like they had, I want to say it was some sort of like SaaS product. It was like sales of like the gold membership. And so if he could sell more gold memberships, that's what mattered to him.
Right.
So it's like, "Well, we increased your gold membership by this percent."
Now you're
Oh, wow.
talking.
And like you'd think that just anyone, if you understood more revenue, that's going to move the needle, but it doesn't always. And so we have to kind of take a step back and say, what is your success metrics? Like what is valuable to you, and put it in that context for them. And so sometimes it's going to be, volume and revenue and this much, and sometimes it's going to be more on the efficiency side, and sometimes it's going to be these things that we never would have even thought of, but they're being measured against. And so we need to help them prove their value by helping to accomplish that.
I hope anybody who works at all with product marketers listened very carefully to what you just said, because that's often, if you take a SaaS type product, that's often the most important thing. They want to hear that you were able to help get the certain type of audience segment that would consider the widget that,
Hmm.
is within the entire suite, but the widget that they're responsible for. And
Right.
you found people that can bring that to a higher value.
Right. And I think that knowing that, it's still hard to do, because let's say someone's listening to this podcast today and they've been in a relationship with, they've been working, let's say 10 months for the stakeholder. Like, it's really awkward to go back and say, "Hey, we've been doing this for a long time, but maybe tell me what your goals are," because that reveals that's vulnerable, right? It reveals that we didn't know
Very
what we've been
much.
doing up until now. So I think, what we can do is, rather than like have this list of like, "Oh, if you didn't start out, perfect from the beginning, then you're screwed." But you can just like ask some questions that are more open ended, like, how can I make this better for you? How can I help you? You know, what's going to be more useful? What do you want from us that's going to improve this? And then, get to those things like, what are you measured on for here, that we can make this, either more clear, more valuable, more high level, that we can make sure we're optimizing for, but just have the dialogue with them. So it can be more conversational, but so that they can bring to say, "Well, this thing is really the thing that's going to help me. Like, how can we help you at your job? How can we take something off your plate?" And you tend to get answers. People don't just say, "Well, if you didn't ask me when we started, why should I answer you now?" People will be like, "Oh, I'd be so happy to have you help me. Here's what's going on now."
Yeah, and like water under the bridge. I think we all know that trust is gained over time, and it took me a long time to learn this, but yes, you've got to lean in when that trust is now there, and it's still a good time to ask those questions. I know before the call, you were telling me that we both revile, different ad platform reps, but that you did have one Google rep that when you were working in an agency said to you, not, "Oh, let me tell you about the quota that I'm supposed to get out of you today,
Right.
Amy." They instead asked you, what was the question they asked you?
The question was, "What can I do to help you get your next promotion?"
Yeah. And like now we're getting kind of, this is important and personal, right? This is
Right.
livelihood. This is, um, but I completely agree with you. I was not prepared for some of the answers that I've heard when I've asked this question. To some, it may be like the answers I've heard back range from our leadership team has told me that we're preparing the company to sell.
Hmm.
I had one who said, "I am in the midst of cancer treatments and I need to know that the pipeline in this company is going to be good while I'm only attending to a part-time to go take care of my personal issues. Heady stuff, but they will appreciate more than you know when you are digging into the separate stages of how to use this data. They don't want a bewildering number of columns and rows. They want that. That's what they really want. And you, if you're lucky, can get to the point where you can talk about it and know what they want, right?
Right, and that's such a good example because, like, think about what you just said. I have cancer and I'm stepping away for cancer treatments. That's what's happening in this person's life. Like, how naive and arrogant is it for us to assume, well, my client, my stakeholder only cares about the data, so I'm not even going to ask. Like, why? Why would you not
Yeah.
ask? These are people, and people have personal and professional KPIs, and they have things that are going on that are keeping them from getting the success that they can. So if we can say, how can I help? How can I make your job easier? How can I help? And like the answer today might even be different from last year. Like, let's be honest about
Yeah,
this. Things
or
like this
that's
change.
right. It might have been important a few months ago if you said, "Well, I'm getting you 5% improvement, period over period." That's fine. I'll tell you when that diagnosis comes, those kind of numbers are not going to matter. That's not going to make that person's day, and they're not thinking about what they're putting in their latte next, right?
Right.
Um,
Right. So
so
being able
that's
to ask that regularly is really important. And
you
that's a
do.
big part of reporting and client relationships. It's not just about the data, it's how we feel about the data. And sometimes we're going to have, I mean, things are going to take the back seat and the front seat and going to be all over the place, and we have to be able to respond to that, not just impressions and clicks.
You're right. So that concludes the second part of the problem, and there's one more left, right?
Yeah. So after we identify the problem and agitate the problem, then it becomes time to solve the problem.
So we come to the solution phase here. This is the last in our three-part process. Tell me how we're going to try and get the solution to be known here and how we're going to get them to see that it's how the story should end.
So one of my favorite quotes is, "A problem clearly defined is already partially solved." I think sometimes we just don't understand what the problem is, and so a solution is not evident, but it's because we just don't know what we're dealing with. When we sit down and like can think through and take the space to understand here's what the problem is, then the solution kind of manifests itself. Not in a weird way, just like it's like, oh, this is a problem here. Here's the fix for that specific thing. And so when we're dealing with, we're introducing the problem and we are agitating it, then the solution should be obvious to both us and our client. Like in some cases, it's going to be a little more obvious to us because we'll know the tactics and the strategy we can use to solve the problem. And in some cases, it's going to be a little bit more obvious to them because they're aware of something going on inside the organization or in leadership that we didn't know about that could better inform what to do about it. So it is definitely a collaboration, but at either way, it should be both parties at that point, or everyone who's involved with this should be like, okay, this is the problem. Yeah, that solution makes sense. There's still levers to pull and things to decide on, like if we're going to go this direction, how deeply do we want to go in this direction? It's not all solved once we identify the solution, but it's still like we know the path forward, and that's a really important step here.
Yeah, to me, it seems something like a serial type of show that you would watch.
Hmm.
They are ending up understanding where we should be coming out of that meeting. And hopefully, you're going to come back to them in the next round with some data that explains, like the next chapter in a serial does, that, yeah, it actually went the way that we hoped.
Right, exactly. And if we're doing our jobs right, we can often come prepared with those numbers. Like there might be some things we just simply don't know. But it shouldn't catch us by surprise if the obvious thing is we need to increase budget to be able to come with some projections of here's what increasing the budget could look like if we go this direction or that direction. And then it really speeds things up because the what we want to avoid is is just not moving forward and not taking action, which is really the easiest thing. It's like, oh, that sounds great. So yeah, you get back to us about the budget, and then we'll look at it, and then we'll have some questions, and then we'll get back to you. And then 6 months, you've
Yeah.
never made any change at all. And it's just you're talking about this idea, but not actually doing it, which is the whole point of it in the first place, is to take action, not just discuss the action.
Yeah, you can do a little bit. You can jump into Keyword Planner. You can maybe throw some numbers on a spreadsheet to come up with a little model. But it's not only helping facilitate their decision, but if they ask a question right as they're making that decision, about how much would this be? Well, you just kind of literally pull out from under the desk so I happen to have at least an estimate on that.
Right. I think Ramit Sethi refers to that as the briefcase technique, right? Is that you come prepared with it, and then it shows that you're prepared, and it works really well. Not that there's anything wrong with saying, I don't know, let me get back to you on that. When when you don't know, it's better to say that than to make something up. But at the same time, it's better to come prepared than to not come prepared. And at a certain point, you should be able to anticipate basic questions and do some basic forecasting to say, here's what I would recommend, because they're ultimately going to be looking to you to have some thought in that whole process.
Yeah. And I think one thing that it also does is it brings those reports, which sometimes we have dreaded in the past, it brings those into the center of the next discussion. They, instead of being, giving it that hard, furrowed brow look that they do, if you've set things up well and you show some continuity from call to call, that report is actually going to be something that they look forward to and something that they can more quickly get into the meat of what you want to talk on the next, right?
Right. Yeah, I think being able to have a very good objective discussion about the numbers is pretty much the goal, right? So it's not us saying, "Hey, look, we're the heroes." It's not us saying, "Hey, we did bad, but it's not our fault," but it's us just saying objectively, here's what happened and here's what we expect to be able to do with these strategies that we're suggesting, and just having everyone in alignment on the same page.
Yeah, it just brings everyone's energy down onto what's happening, which is where it should be, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Amy, if people want to find out more about you, more about Paid Search Magic, where can they go?
So we have a website, paidsearchmagic.com. I kind of tell people it's barely a website. It's not anything that we've put much time into lately. But we do have a Facebook group. It's called Google Ads for Savvy Digital Marketers. It's free to join, and we have a lot of good discussions over there.
And I will have links to that in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was great.
I'm really glad to have you. And to the listener, I sure hope that you are ready to implement some piece of what Amy said. She knows what she's talking about, and this is the way to do it. If you want to have people who actually appreciate the mountains of work that it takes behind the scenes to achieve the numbers, this is the way to get that appreciation there. And I would hope that you share those with someone else if they're struggling with how their reports are working, and that it gave you some way to make your funnel even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter @Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.